Hello, and welcome to Insightful Conversations with your host, Three Principles practitioner, Adey-Jones. Join her each week as she welcomes some of the world's leading Three Principles teachers and practitioners who share how this understanding has dramatically improved the quality of their lives and the lives of those they work with.
I'm so excited to have as my guest today Alexandra Amor. Alexandra is an Amazon best-selling author, as well as a blogger, podcaster, enthusiastic entrepreneur, and someone with a lifelong interest in how humans, including herself, work. Alexandra began her writing career with an award-winning memoir about the 10 years she spent in a Canadian cult in the 1990s. She has also written animal adventures for middle grade readers, several historical mysteries set in frontier British Columbia, and a cozy romantic mystery. At StopSufferingAbout.com, Alexandra explores our understanding of our innate well-being and wholeness with a focus on the new paradigm of psychology known as the Three Principles. Welcome, Alexandra. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much.
I just finished reading your memoir, A Cult, a Love Story, and it was amazing. It was beautifully written, as I mentioned to you, as well as definitely one of those page turners. One thing you said, which I love in the beginning, is nobody intentionally joins a cult. Yeah. So can you explain, I mean, I know what that means, but just expand on that for me.
So when you're in a cult as well, the other part of that is that you don't call it a cult. You only realize it's a cult once you've left. And so people say that what we do is we join groups of people that we really like, and a group of people who has that has similar values to us, people that we really like, people that we have a lot in common with. And the sort of sociological conditions that occur in a cult can occur in any kind of a group. It doesn't have to be about spirituality or religion. It can be about politics. It can be about or involved in the workplace. And so, yeah, you just join a group of people that you like, and then it evolves into something dangerous, basically.
And you mentioned too that's why you called it, a love story too, because it was something that you loved spirituality, you loved the people you were with, you even loved the person that was, the head of the cult. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating that what struck me is that it's the pacing of the book was like, in the beginning I was thinking to myself, oh, this isn't so bad, this isn't so bad. Yep. And then once I'd finished the book, I was thinking, oh, was it really that bad? And I realized it was almost like being in a cult, because the temperature was being boiled, as you say, with the frog, so slowly that it was only after I put it down I went, that was absolutely outrageous. So it was speak about that. Was that intentional, or was that?
Well, I think just by sort of describing how the events happened linearly, I think that happened naturally in the book. Mm-hmm. And so, as you say, it starts out very innocent. It was a meditation class that I joined. Nothing dangerous about it, or seemingly anyway. Mm-hmm. And then it just gradually becomes, what happens is the cult leader starts to tie knots in your thinking, in your brain, and your thinking becomes, or your choices become bounded. There's a famous book about cults called Bounded Choice, and that's such a good way to describe it, because what happens is that you start to believe that your choices become more and more limited. And so with the structure of the book, with it following my journey, I think that probably evolved naturally, the way that readers experience what happened to me.
Yeah, it was fascinating. And also what I saw, there was a lot I saw in it. I mean, I think I've had some narrow escapes with cults myself. But having been in an abusive relationship, there was a lot of parallels with that, with the sort of smoke and mirrors, and as you say, the tying you in knots, and you doubting yourself, but you love this person, and you don't. I mean, it's very very subtle, but it's the same sort of thing.
It absolutely is the same. And there, in fact, there's a book on my bookshelf behind me. I don't think you can see it, but it's called Take Back Your Life. And the subtitle is Recovering from Cults and Abusive Relationships.
Oh, wow.
So the paradigm that exists in a cult is exactly the same as it is in an abusive relationship. It's just that in a cult, it's one leader to many people.
Yeah.
And in an abusive relationship, it's one to one. But it's the same sort of thing, blaming the victim for anything that goes wrong. Tying your thoughts in knots and making your choices fewer and fewer, while at the same time, and it's such a bizarre circumstance that people can't really understand unless they've been involved in it, at the same time you do really love the people that you're involved with, or the abuser in the case of a relationship like that.
Yeah, in my relationship, I didn't even consider it abusive while I was in it. I knew I was in an awful lot of pain, but it was only afterwards where I was watching a program about physical abuse in a relationship. And because I hadn't been physically abused, I couldn't call it an abusive relationship in my mind. But as I was watching this program, I was making all these connections, and it was like, but that's how I felt, and that's how I, reacted. And it's really interesting because it doesn't have to look a certain way.
No,
It doesn't.
no, exactly. Yeah, and I think, and when we're inside something like that, it's a case of you can't see the forest for the trees. It's really hard to see what's going on, and that was one reason I wrote the book, was because for family members or loved ones of someone who's been in a cult, it's really difficult to understand why their loved one is involved, and how they can't see that they're being manipulated. And so one of the reasons that I wanted to tell my story in a very personal way was to help people to see that it's progressive. It doesn't just happen overnight, and that there are certain conditions that exist, and that when someone is really deliberately setting out to manipulate and control another person, it's really hard to avoid having that happen if you don't understand, what the objective is of the cult leader or the abusive person.
And I think there's also a lot of seduction in the beginning when and certain types of people are more vulnerable. So do you feel that there was anything in your background that sort of made you vulnerable to that environment, that feeling special? I know you touch on it in the book.
Yeah, I think there were a few things. It's kind of, and that's the other thing too, is that it's a perfect storm. Some people say, oh, I could never get involved in a cult, I'm too aware or whatever. But it isn't just one thing that leads you down that path. There's several things that happen all at once. So in my case, I was really young. I was 21, just about to turn 22. I was in a period of transition, and that's transitions are really vulnerable times for any human in any stage of our lives. When we don't have a clear sense of our own identity, it's easier to be manipulated in that way. Exactly. And that's often why cults or high demand religions have offices at university campuses, because people who have just left home for the first time and are in their late teens and are living on their own for probably the very first time in their life are in that kind of a period of transition. So they're very vulnerable. So for me, it was age. It was, I think it was also being a natural sort of spiritual quester and looking for answers. And our cult leader really provided a lot of answers that felt true to me. And then another thing I say in the book too is that there's nothing as dangerous as a little bit of the truth.
Yeah, I remember
think one of her tricks was that much of what she said really resonated with me, or some of it. It would depend on the thing. And then the rest of it, in hindsight, wasn't true. But I wasn't able at the time to pull those things apart. And make my own decisions about what she was saying at the time. I just kind of swallowed everything whole.
Yeah, I know. And especially the peer pressure within the group too, to not to speak out, to not to listen to that, your inner wisdom saying this doesn't feel right, this is not making sense.
Yes.
That's very interesting.
Exactly.
So I know you didn't when did you come across the principles after you, because you got out of the cult basically yourself. You weren't sort of rescued, as it were. You chose to leave on your own. And I know that you were you were in therapy, and you had a lot of support to help you see, what had, been happening to you. So when was it that you what was it like for you? And then what was it like once you came across the principles? I'd love to hear that little transition there.
Yes. So I left the cult in 2000 and then ran across the principles in about 2017. A girlfriend introduced me to them. So there was a big gap there. A lot of time had passed. And I spent, from 2000 till 2007 or 8 in therapy, just figuring everything out and unraveling all those knots in my head and figuring out what mattered to me and that sort of thing. And then wrote the book in 2008, 2009. So as we record this, it's actually 10 years old, which is kind of a surprise. So then after writing the book, I've always been someone who's been really interested in spirituality and personal growth and all that kind of stuff. So I explored lots of things, and I took coach training and read all kinds of self-help books and, attended a few seminars and that kind of thing. And then when I ran into the principles, when my girlfriend introduced them to me, as so often what people say is that something just felt different about them.
Yeah.
And the thing I noticed right off the bat was a girlfriend suggested I read Michael Neill's The Inside Out Revolution. And when I did, a week or so later, she checked in with me and said, how are you enjoying it? And I said, well, I really like it, but he hasn't told me what to do yet. and she laughed and said, well, no, he's not going to. And so that to me was really radical. And I liked the way that felt, that there was just this sense of ease and relaxation that came over me, where for the past, nearly 20 years, I'd been just frantically applying all kinds of strategies and techniques to try to fix myself, quote unquote. So the principles being so different from that really, really caught my attention. And then I just continued to explore them further.
Yeah. Yeah, I resonate with that so completely. I was on years and years of therapy, every self-help book you could imagine. I mean, my house looked like Barnes and Noble on the inside with the self-help section. And it's what I loved about the principles was that it was, really sending you back home to who you are inside, and especially I imagine after coming from a very overpowering sort of guru figure that tells you, that what you're thinking is basically wrong, and she has a direct line to God, and this is what you need to be doing, and you're going against your instincts. How beautiful for an understanding to help point you back to, no, you know what's best for you. It's inside of you. It doesn't come from somebody else.
Yes, I just absolutely love that part of it, and really find that I've thrived because of that continued pointing back toward your own wisdom. And such a different paradigm than being in a cult, the complete polar opposite.
Exactly.
Really.
And also that we're not broken, that we're completely whole. I mean, oh my God, all those years of believing that, it's on the outside, the striving. If I just get this, if I read one more book, my addiction was books. If I read one more book, I'm going to get it. And I'm going to be at peace with myself.
Yes. Yeah, I can really relate to that as well.
And there was a point about a year ago where I just took all my self-help books off the shelf and just sort of like discarded them. It was not only that, there were books like sort of, so I'm a 4 on the Enneagram, or I'm a this on a that, and all these constructs of who I was and how to understand how I worked. But it's so simple. We just don't know it. So how did you, I love the title of the website you have, The Stop Suffering About. It's so brilliant. So when did that, on your journey, when did that start coming into form for you?
So that came about earlier this year. So February or March 2019, I was just so interested in the principles and learning so much and benefiting so much. And I wanted to share that. And I wondered how I could do that. And I had thought of several different website names, but this was one that really jumped out at me.
Mm-hmm.
And um, yeah, so started really with just a blog and a podcast. And the blog was focused on things I was learning and wanted to share with other people. And then the podcast, I interviewed other people who are following the principles, or
Mm-hmm.
teaching about them, or coaching about them, or whatever. And I love podcasting and radio shows like this because there's a win-win-win for everybody. You know, the
Mm-hmm.
person listening learns something new. I learned something new from being the host,
Mm-hmm.
and my guests, you know, got a little bit of exposure for their work and their books and everything. So yeah, I just adored that.
Yeah. No, I know. I feel like that too. I feel like, God, how
Yeah.
lucky am I? I get to be in this conversation with the most amazing people on earth. So,
Yeah.
and hopefully, it's benefiting people out there too who are listening. So that is great. Now, I know that, I just have a quick question. Were you always a writer? Was that always part of you? Or is that something you developed later?
Yeah, it was been around for a long time. I used to write. I've always been a journaler. Always sort of wrote stories as a teenager, and then very early on, once I left university, I could just tell that I didn't fit in the corporate world. And the one thing I wanted to do was to leave my corporate job and work at home so that I would have more time to write. So that came about very early in my sort of mid 20s, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I know that you are coming up with a new program to help people write difficult stories. How did that? I mean, clearly I know how that came about, but what made you? Yeah, just tell me a little bit more how that developed, how that idea
Yeah,
developed.
I think there's a lot of information out there about writing memoir, and I've seen, I've read several books myself, and there are other online courses, but I've never seen anybody focus on what it's like to write about a difficult subject. And so that's what I thought
Mm-hmm.
I could sort of bring a little bit of expertise to the table, having written my memoir and gone through, all the things that happen when you're writing about something challenging, like trying to communicate it in a clear way to your audience. And
Mm-hmm.
the thing that I'm really big on too, or focused on, is that as we're writing the memoir, it really needs to be about sort of an uncensored telling of our story. But then at some point, we need to take off that hat and put on a different hat and make sure that the book is beneficial for the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And too often, I think I see memoirs that are more indulgent than they need to be.
Yeah.
And my approach is that a memoir, especially when it's about a difficult subject, really needs to focus on the reader. But it is a two-step process. I don't think you can do that out of the gate. I
Mm-hmm.
think as someone who's had a really difficult experience, we need to first just get our story down on the page and make sure that we've said everything we need to say. And then we have all the time we need to turn it into something that will benefit other people.
Mm. Yeah, I love that because, I mean, again, I there was sort of like moments of humor almost in your book, which I think it's so important when you are dealing with a very, a tough subject, that there's some sort of like reprieve from that, whether it's not. We'll talk about that, because is that part of how you see telling the story, is that there.
Yeah, absolutely. It can't just be one note all the
Yeah.
way through. And I mean, life isn't like that.
Yeah.
And even when we're having a difficult experience, of course, there are moments of lightness or levity.
Mm-hmm.
And, life is such a paradoxical thing in a lot of ways, in that, we can be in a devastating situation and there can still be a moment of laughter,
Yeah.
or, yeah. So I just think too, when we're writing a memoir about something difficult, if we go down to a really low note and then stay there, it's
Yeah.
going to be impossible for the reader to get through it.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And having considered writing my memoir for many years, you also reach a point in your life too where you do look back, and it for me anyway, I look back and I think that's just a really interesting story. I don't have the emotional attachment anymore. It doesn't, sort of take me down when I remember something that was particularly painful. It's more just sort of like a wow, that happened. So there's a detachment, which I think, for me, a much better place to write from, rather than when I was in the throes of whatever it is I was, suffering about, to use your word.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. And I think, I wrote my memoir almost 10 years after I left the cult. And so almost 20 years after I got in. So there was a lot of detachment there, which I think was really helpful, because
Yeah.
when we're able to look at something, with a little bit of a gap between us and it, then we can see the lighter moments, and we
Yeah.
don't take, things so personally, and we're able to share with a bit of objectivity, which I think is really important if there are lessons that we're trying to pass along.
Yeah.
And I think, going back to my original point about getting, the two-step process, getting our story out and how important that is in an uncensored way, but then taking off our hat and making sure it's about the reader. Um, when we have a bit of detachment, that enables that second step,
Yeah.
much to be much easier for
Yeah.
us.
No, exactly. And I just have a quick question, because I know a lot of people, when they write memoir, and I know this comes up for me, is, you don't want to hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, you've changed all the names in your book, but still, were there anybody that you felt that you needed to sort of take into consideration, or had a hard time with you sharing your story?
Well, mine's a little bit interesting in that by the time I wrote it, I was so far estranged from all the people that I mentioned. So I hadn't spoken to anybody in the cult for 10 years or so. And so I didn't really I didn't really take their feelings into consideration, other than wanting to protect their
Yeah.
privacy and make sure that yeah, that I protected conversations that happened years before, that when you have a conversation with somebody, you never expect it to be then in a book, down the road. So I really did want to protect that for them. But I know for a lot of people who are writing memoir, it's a huge consideration, because if they're
Yeah.
writing about family or even relationships that happened in the past, and they still have perhaps connections to those people, it's a really tricky issue. um, but a couple of things come to mind. One is Anne Lamott, who writes about writing. She wrote Bird by Bird. She has a great quote about, you are entitled to tell your story. It's your story and you get to tell it. And if people didn't want that story told, then they should have behaved better at the time, which I think is kind of great. Um, and and the other thing is that, yeah, that memoirists can do things like changing people's names or changing the situation slightly, just so it's not identifiable to
Yeah.
characters who are in the story.
Yeah. Well, we're actually running out of time. I can't believe it. It goes so fast, but I can't wait to hear more about this program you're offering. I know it's if you go on your website, share your website.
So it's alexandraamor.com, just like that, no hyphens or anything.
Yeah. And when do you hope to have this program up and running by?
I hope, I want to say autumn 2019. It always takes longer to do things than we think it will, but
Yes.
I've got my fingers crossed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I might be one of the first people signing up because I need a little help with my memoirs. So I really look forward to talking to you more about that. And again, your book, you said it's actually having a resurgence, even though you wrote it 10 years ago. It's really, really popular again. So, and it's an amazing read. It's definitely worthwhile reading it. And thank you so much. And I hope to see you again soon.
Oh, thank you so much, Del. It's been such a pleasure being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye bye.